This is part two of the miter saw bench build. I'm digging some wood out of this little shed for the tops that are going to hold the saws. And it can be kind of a pain to get some wood out of here when you need it every now and then, but I don't have to dig in there all too often. The tops that I'm cutting are a little too wide for the saw, so I'm making a couple of cuts with the fence off the other side of the saw blade. And then the other cuts are actually narrow enough I can use the fence in a more traditional method. Here I'm just cutting out the covers for the tops. I just cut on the table saw. The plasma cutter makes a really nice square template, so I'll use these pieces of metal and a router to cut off the excess from the wood tops from the table saw. I cut them a little larger than they needed to be so that I'd have a little room to play when I go to adhere the tops, these covers to the tops for the miter saw bench. This is really thin sheet metal. I think it's 16 gauge, so it's really easy to work with. I wanted it to be light so that there wasn't a bunch of weight in these stands, and I just cut up the pieces there with a cut wheel on a handheld grinder. And then these pieces sit outside, and I just use a wire wheel to clean up the surfaces. And I haven't cleaned up the top of this yet, but I will. And I flip the sheet over where it meets the glue is nice and clean right now. I just used some construction adhesive for this, and then just kind of pressed everything down and then stomped on a little bit to spread the glue out. I think I let those sit for maybe a day or so, and then this is me like maybe a day later, kind of cleaning up the other side of the surfaces, and just use wire wheel again, a little denatured alcohol to clean everything up. And this is the routing, so I'm using that nice edge that the plasma cutter put on there and following it with a router. That's just a piece of maple that was run through the joiner as a nice straight edge. And this is the sides of the stands. I came up with this pattern just to kind of alleviate some of the weight that's in the side supports. I wanted them to be nice and stiff, but I didn't want them to weigh a ton, so I kind of ended up sacrificing a little bit of 1/4 inch plate steel here just to get something that was really rigid but not super heavy and was easy to weld to. I ended up cutting out 4 of these. I don't show all the cutting here because I just think it lasts too long, but I ended up cutting up 4 of these. It wasn't too bad. Was able to fit a fair amount of this on just that first half of that sheet there. And then if the cutting goes well, the pieces are pretty easy to remove, and I removed the slag from the cuts a million different ways, and that time I was just using a scraper to knock the slag off really quick, and then this wire wheel to kind of quickly clean up the rest of the piece and the rust and anything else that might be on there. Uh, Wire wheel actually kind of cuts down on the edges too. It kind of just knocks them back and doesn't make them quite as sharp. And this is just some real quick footage of cutting out these plates. You'll see where they go here in a little bit. But that was just some scrap I pulled out of the scrap bin, and it's always nice to be able to pull from the scrap bin whenever you want to make some little widget or something in the shop. I'm just knocking back the sharp edges on these plates because people's hands will be around them all the time, and I want it to not shred our hands every time we use them. I'm tacking those together now on what will be the roller plates. I use the TIG welder for this, and it just works really well, and it's quick, and I have a TIG button on that torch, so I'm not using a foot pedal, and it's kind of, you just command an amperage, and when you push the button you get all that amperage. It's not variable. I have a variable amperage one, I just haven't been able to test it yet. And I have to space these rollers out from the top of the bench, and I'm using these new Fireball tool spacers. Shims is what they call them. They're magnetic, so you can stack up, kind of mix and match to get the spacing that you need, and stick them to your piece and then tack things in place. And they work really good instead of just trying to cut a piece of wood to or something like that every time to get some kind of spacing that you need. I want the rollers to sit flush with the top of the bench, or at least be in the same plane. And so I have that stack of shims there representing the height of the roller, and then that piece of angle iron is keeping the top plane of what will be the roller in line with the top of the bench. And then I'm just tacking things again with the TIG welder and the TIG button. And then I finish weld everything out with the MIG welder. And I'm not going crazy again here with the welding. I mean, these things will be way stronger than they need to be, probably stronger than the rail that's on the bench that's holding them. I think I made 4 of these in total, and then what you're seeing here is kind of the end stop. So it's, if you're making repeat cuts, this will be what catches the pieces. And if you don't want to make repeat cuts, you can just replace this one with another roller, and then your material will just end up sitting on the rollers when you're done cutting it. But I thought this would be kind of handy if you had a bunch of pieces you wanted to make exactly the same. You can just set this up somewhere on the bench and then just make all of your repeat cuts and then move on to the next thing. At some point, maybe I'll put a tape measure, a sticky tape on the rail, so you have something to reference for your repeat cuts. And I just did a tab and slot design with this and then cut it out on the plasma table, and it just really makes assembly go a whole lot faster. And the last plate actually just fit in there so tight I didn't even need to put a square or anything against it. And then I just do some plug welds with the MIG welder and kind of fill everything up. And again, I'm not really putting a lot of weld on this. It's going to be way stronger than what the bench can take as far as weight. I'm not planning on cutting really heavy material on this setup. I mean, the saws are kind of the limiting factor on material size. So even though that DeWalt saw can cut some pretty heavy material if you really wanted it to, I typically don't put it through that kind of stress test, I guess. I'll leave the really like heavy plate cutting and tube cutting for the jet bandsaw that I have. And it seems to work a lot better for stuff like that. And I just took the grinder and kind of smoothed this up. I didn't get too crazy. I just kind of wanted to make all the surfaces nice and smooth and grind down all the plug welds. And here I'm just marking out these drawer slides for what's going to be the sides of the stand. Is kind of this drawer pull design that I have going on. And the drawer slides are, I think they're only 10-inch. They're full extends, and then they lock closed and locked open. So it's kind of nice. It'll keep everything rigid when you're running the saws. And here I'm just putting a little chamfer on those holes. And I think everybody's kind of seen this before. I just use these Milwaukee drivers to tap all the holes and just kind of rinse and repeat on all these components. And I'm using that block of wood here in the front of the picture just to hold the end of that plate while I drill it. And that quick clamp vise actually has a lot of holding power, so you don't feel like anything's going to come flying out of there at you. There you can see all the plates that I made on the plasma cutter. They're all the same, and the cut heights of the saws are a little different, so you'll see here later on the mounting height's just slightly different. If you've been following along these videos, you also see that these benches have been changed, and we've added all these holes so we can utilize all these really cool welding clamps and stuff that I've always wanted to have as a fabricator, and now I finally have them. Just putting some small welds on this. This is going to be the base to the top of the miter saw stand. Drawer slides go in between it, and the wood top and the metal cover that we cut earlier in the video will sit on top of this. You'll see here in a minute, I think I take this and I just flatten one side of it. I don't put welds everywhere because it doesn't really need it. And, I just make sure one side is completely flat so that the top board will sit on there without having any kind of weird deflection or bow in it. I've been taking a fair amount of video of the work that we've been doing to these weld tables, and I want to release it at some point in time as kind of another shop update, and the plan is to finish out this whole pattern and then do some drawers and stuff in the tables just for storage. This is mounting up the drawer slides to the side supports, and then you'll see this plate here is going to weld to that square tubing frame that I just completed. Building stuff like this This should be such a challenge getting everything squared up and put together. I didn't have any of this fancy stuff until just recently, and I've really been enjoying having access to really nice tools like those fireball squares and this table now with the tooling holes in it. This plate's just going to be kind of a cover, more or less. It's going to stop all the chips from the saws from falling through and falling on the floor. Um, I'll put you'll see it later too, the vacuum and stuff underneath these. And then there's an air compressor right there as well. So hopefully cleanup after using the saw will be a lot easier. And I'm just getting everything kind of tacked and in place and throwing some shims in where I need it just to make sure there aren't any gaps in this plate. And that plate's what's going to really give that back cross member its strength when I mount this to the wall later on. I have to do some finish welding on this, so I'm going to take that kind of support or shelf support out of there for now, and so I can weld on it and grind on it and not get the hinges all filthy and overheated and kind of damage them. So kind of doing all this finish welding with that out of the frame for now, and then I'll put it back in there before I mount it to the wall. McMaster-Carr came in clutch again for all the hardware on this project, so had all the drawer slides and pretty much anything that's not steel or just a standard part came from McMaster-Carr. Here I'm just stitch welding this plate on here, kind of doing all the finish welding on this stand, and I don't really plan out where these stitches go. I just kind of eyeball like an even spacing and go from there. If I'm building something to print, I'll mark them out, but something like this for shop improvement projects, it's just kind of all ad hoc and off the top of the head. Same way with marking out the holes now to mount this base to that wood top, and just kind of trying to eyeball something that looks halfway decent. And I'm using that Starrett spring center punch right there, and that has become one of my new favorite tools. A guy showed me that not too long ago, and I decided to pick one up off of Amazon, and I love it. It's very powerful. It's adjustable too, and you can with aluminum almost get carried away with it. On thin gauge aluminum, almost punch all the way through it. I'm just marking out these screws. I cut these down to length. I didn't have anything the right length in the shop, so I just modified a few screws to use to secure this frame to the top of the miter saw bench, and just kind of drilled through, marked everything, and removed the top, and then finished pilot hole all those screw holes, and came back and drove the screws in. Now I'm kind of finally getting back into putting everything back together, and have Sophia here in the shop to help me get this thing mounted to the wall. It was definitely a two-person job. Couldn't quite conquer it on my own. We use this Bosch auto leveling laser to raise both these benches up to the same height, and you can see I kind of shut the lights off, or some of the lights off in the shop to make it easier to see the laser. And then in order to know where to bring these saws up to, we had to finish these roller stands. So kind of doing some finish assembly on them here and getting everything put together. You kind of have to set them on the track first and get all the racing of the line, and then you can mount them to whatever you're wanting to mount them to and slide them back on the rail again. We just use shim packs and this little Genie roll around forklift to kind of get things close, and then measured, from the top of the saw to the base, and struck a line on the wall. I measured out these studs beforehand and just pre-drilled all the holes so that when I mounted to the wall, everything was kind of where I needed it to be. That stand didn't look like it was in the right spot, like in that shot, but what you don't see is behind that drywall is there's a big beam, because this shop is a pole barn construction. So I kind of intended for these stands to lap there just so that there was plenty of structure in the shop to get a hold of. And you can kind of see the intent there is to let these stands pull away from the wall so you can access the rollers. This particular saw stand probably wouldn't need to move out, but it's nice that it can. When I get onto the DeWalt saw, you'll see that it actually does need to move away from the wall in order to make it work properly. And I'm just drilling some holes here. And I made the square tubing underneath of this designed to accept some self-tap screws for all 4 of those holes in the Evolution saw. And then the DeWalt saw is actually going to sit on a rotary that you see right here. Just using a couple of levels to check the alignment from the saws, and then from the saws across the top of the table, and use those levels to strike lines on the wall and get a mounting height, for each saw. You can see I had to add a couple pieces of angle iron to the left side of this saw just so that I could reach it out to another stud in the wall. That outlet just happened to be kind of on the wrong side of the stud, and I didn't want to cover it because I use it to plug all the welders into. And I had to make some modifications to this plate. I don't know what this plate is technically called. If anybody has any questions on it, they can ask. I'll certainly go out to the McMaster-Carr orders and track down what it was, but it's just like a rotary table for assembly, I believe, and I had to kind of do some changes to it. I'm marking out this like basic saw locations for cutting. It's 45, 90, 45, and then the other locations are kind of a storage location. So when the saw is really not in use and you're wanting to use the Evolution miter saw, you can turn this DeWalt saw out of the way and get kind of nice uninterrupted access to the Evolution saw. I didn't know how mounting this plate and mounting the saw to the plate would go. It just kind of looked about right on McMaster-Carr, and the dimensions seemed to work out. So I kind of thought I would fumble my way through it, or at least be able to modify things if I needed to. And it turns out it wasn't too bad really to get things modified. I kind of squared up the saw and used the Evolution's fence to kind of square the plate to the table, and then I can set the little detent knob that I'm just placing down there now and get it kind of in the right spot. And have to take this plate apart just to get access to all the holes so I can mark out the mounting holes in this plate. Here I'm just pre-drilling the holes for the wood screws I'm going to use, and then I come back with a little bit bigger bit and then just drill out the steel plate just so that I don't break a screw off in that steel plate. And so I'm actually using the wood in this to secure that bearing to this top plate. And then I'm marking out the holes that I need to drill all the way through the top plate to get the bolts back in the platter again. And you'll be able to access these holes from the bottom side if you ever need to take the plate back off. And I don't show it in the video, I don't think, but then I just ended up mounting the DeWalt saw to the platter just using some 1/4-20 bolts and then tapping the platter to accept them. I only use a couple of them. It really doesn't need all 4 of them to hold the saw in place. And these are just some small wood screws that I use to hold this bearing down to the plate, and then set the top plate back on and run the bolts up from the bottom. I forgot to put that on video, but I just use that ratchet that's sitting on the top there. Now I'm just mounting down this little kind of rotary lock mechanism. Again, just really lucky, just right off the shelf from McMaster-Carr, and some slight modifications, and I was able to get kind of the functionality out of it that I want. So I'm just kind of testing everything out. And these last few videos kind of show you the intended operation. It's maybe a little confusing. I tried to show it as best I can, and how I intend to operate this. And we get on projects sometime, and I'll make some nice videos that show the operation of this a little more clear. But I think just from viewing this video and get kind of an idea of what we were going for there. Just did kind of one long panning shot of the whole bench and the setup, and it's been looking really nice, and I'm really going to enjoy using this setup for projects in the future. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Check out some of our other videos too. Follow us on social media. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments section, and we'll answer them for you. Thanks, everybody.